He assumed I'd break down when the divorce papers arrived on Valentine's Day, so I delivered the perfect response. People underestimate Georgia's soil, and women like me, they see red clay and think nothing good can grow here. They see a black woman from Macon with calloused hands and assume I'm just along for the ride. What they don't see is that red clay holds secrets better than concrete vaults, and women like me, we've been making something from nothing since before our grandmothers could vote. My name is Danielle Hayes, and I'm about to tell you how I built an empire while my husband thought he was building his. It started 12 years ago when Graham Harrow walked into my agricultural economics class at the University of Georgia with wine-stained fingers and dreams bigger than his trust fund. He was this golden-haired California boy who'd transferred from UC Davis, full of stories about his family's connections in Napa Valley and how Georgia was sleeping on its wine potential. I was the scholarship kid from Macon who'd grown up watching my grandmother coax miracles from backyard soil, majoring in AG Econ because I understood that land was the only wealth that couldn't be taken away. Graham noticed me during Professor Martinez's lecture on sustainable farming economics. I'd raised my hand to point out a flaw in the professor's cost analysis model for small-scale viticulture, something about how he wasn't accounting for the long-term soil improvement that comes with proper cover crop rotation. After class, Graham cornered me by the vending machines. "That was brilliant," he said, those blue eyes sparkling like he discovered gold. "You actually know farming, not just theory." I should have been flattered. Instead, I felt that familiar prickle of being exotified, the smart black girl who was somehow surprising for knowing her stuff. But Graham seemed different. He asked real questions about my grandmother's garden, about soil composition in Middle Georgia, about whether I thought muscadine grapes could compete with European varietals. By our third coffee date, he was sketching vineyard layouts on napkins. By our 6th month together, he was talking about we and our vineyard like it was destiny instead of his daddy's money making dreams possible. "Danielle, baby, we could be pioneers," he'd say, those hands that had never touched manual labor gesturing wildly. "Georgia, wine country. Can you imagine?" I could imagine. Better than he knew. See, while Graham was dreaming in broad strokes, I was calculating in spreadsheets. My grandmother hadn't just taught me about soil. She taught me about ownership. "Baby girl," she'd whisper while we worked her quarter-acre plot, "land is the only thing they can't take back once you've got the papers. Everything else is just conversation." So when Graham's father finally agreed to invest in his son's passion project, a check that would make most people's heads spin, I was ready with research. I'd found 80 acres of scrubland in Crawford County, an hour south of Macon. The soil tests I'd quietly commissioned showed perfect drainage and mineral content. The climate data I'd analyzed suggested we could grow both traditional European grapes and native muscadines. The previous owner was an elderly farmer eager to sell to someone who wouldn't subdivide for development. What Graham didn't know was that I'd also been saving every penny from my part-time job at the campus agricultural extension office, plus the money my grandmother had left me when she passed during our junior year. It wasn't much compared to the Harrow family contribution, but it was enough for what I had planned. "We should form an LLC," I suggested during one of our late-night planning sessions. "Hayes and Harrow Cellars." Sounds official, right? Graham loved the idea. "You handle the paperwork, babe. I need to focus on the winemaking side." That's when I made the smartest decision of my life. I called my godmother, Aunt Pearl, who'd retired the year before after 30 years as a tax attorney in Atlanta. She'd been like a second grandmother to me, and she understood exactly what I was asking when I explained the situation. "Baby," she said over our lunch at the varsity, "you want to protect yourself in case this boy turns out to be less than he seems." Something like that. 2 weeks later, Macon Black Oak Holdings LLC was born, a shell company with me as the managing member and Aunt Pearl as my silent partner. When Hayes and Harrow Cellars LLC was formed the following month, Macon Black Oak Holdings owned 51% of the shares. Graham's contribution bought him 49%, making him the minority partner in his own dream. The paperwork was clean, legal, and completely transparent to anyone who bothered to read it. Graham never bothered. He signed where I told him to sign, his eyes already glazed over with visions of wine barrels and tasting rooms. "You're so good with this business stuff," he'd say, kissing my forehead while I organized contracts. "I just want to make wine." We were married the spring after graduation in a small ceremony at the vineyard, or what would become the vineyard once we cleared the kudzu and planted the vines. Graham's family flew in from California, looking slightly bewildered by the Georgia heat and the red dust that clung to their designer shoes. My family filled the other side, church ladies in their finest hats, my cousin's kids running between the folding chairs we'd set up among the young grapevines. Graham cried during his vows. Real tears, talking about how I'd shown him that dreams were only as strong as the soil they grew in, how he couldn't wait to build something beautiful with me. I cried too, but for different reasons. I was thinking about my grandmother's words, about the papers in my safe deposit box, about the future I was planting that he couldn't even see. The first 5 years were backbreaking. While Graham took weekend trips to Napa and Sonoma, networking with winemakers and sommeliers, I stayed in Crawford County nursing vine cuttings and learning enology through online courses. Every invoice for equipment, every barrel order, every social media advertisement ran through Macon Black Oak Holdings accounts before being allocated to Hayes and Harrow. Graham called them my cute spreadsheets and never looked deeper than the bottom line. I didn't mind the condescension. I was too busy building. When our first vintage won a bronze medal at the Atlanta wine competition, Graham was the one who gave interviews to the local papers. "It's been my dream since college," he told the Crawford County Herald, standing in front of barrels I'd personally selected and cleaned. Creating something uniquely Georgian. I stood beside him in the photos, smiling, my hands folded to hide the calluses that told the real story. By year 7, Hayes and Harrow was turning a real profit. Food and Wine magazine mentioned us in a piece about emerging southern wine regions. Graham started traveling more, consulting with startup vineyards, speaking at conferences about the future of Georgia viticulture. He'd come home full of stories about investors and expansion opportunities, his eyes bright with possibility. "We should think bigger, Danielle," he'd say over dinner in the farmhouse we'd renovated together. "Maybe open a second location. Maybe partner with someone in North Georgia." We was becoming increasingly theoretical. Graham was the face of Hayes and Harrow, the one who shook hands and made deals. I was the one who made sure those deals actually worked, who managed the books, who remembered that romance dies quickly when the bills come due. But success was changing him in ways I hadn't expected. The boy who'd been charmed by my soil knowledge was becoming the man who interrupted my explanations to investors. The husband who'd once asked my opinion on every decision was making announcements about our business direction without consulting me. The worst part? I could see it happening, but I couldn't stop it. Graham wasn't trying to push me out. He was just gradually forgetting I'd ever been essential to begin with. That's when I started planning for the worst while hoping for the best. Because women like me, we know that the sweetest grapes sometimes grow on the most neglected vines. And sometimes, you have to prune what's dying to save what's worth keeping. Little did Graham know his biggest harvest was about to become my greatest vintage. The irony wasn't lost on me that Graham chose Valentine's Day for his grand finale. Our tasting room glowed with dozens of votive candles I'd arranged that morning, casting warm amber light across the reclaimed barnwood walls. 23 couples had reserved tables for our Romance and Rose evening, a special tasting menu I designed to showcase our best vintages, paired with chocolate from a local artisan. The air hummed with intimate conversation and the clink of crystal glasses, exactly the kind of atmosphere that had made Hayes and Harrow a destination for anniversary celebrations and proposals. I moved between tables in my black dress, the one Graham used to say made my skin look like honey in candlelight, carrying our 2019 Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon in a crystal decanter. Mrs. Henderson from the Garden Club was telling her husband how she'd never understood wine until she tasted our muscadine blend. The young couple at table 7 were holding hands across their cheese board, completely lost in each other and our Viognier. This was my favorite part of the business, the part Graham had stopped caring about once the accolades started rolling in. He preferred the industry events, the networking dinners, the magazine interviews. I preferred this, watching people discover something beautiful, creating moments that would become memories. I was approaching the corner table where the Washingtons were celebrating their 40th anniversary when the door burst open with enough force to rattle the antique mason jars holding our table flowers. Graham stood silhouetted in the doorway, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his face flushed with something that looked like panic disguised as determination. Behind him, a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit clutched a manila envelope like it contained nuclear codes. The room fell silent. 23 couples turned to stare, their romantic evening suddenly interrupted by whatever drama was unfolding. I felt heat creep up my neck. Not embarrassment, but that familiar anger that started in my stomach and worked its way outward like spilled wine staining white fabric. Graham's eyes found mine across the room, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Cruelty. Not just indifference or dismissiveness, but actual pleasure at what he was about to do. "Danielle," he called out, his voice carrying that stage whisper quality actors use when they want the whole audience to hear. "Sorry to interrupt your little party, but we have some business to handle." I set the decanter down carefully on the Washington's table, my hands steady despite the tremor I felt starting in my chest. "Graham, we have guests. Whatever this is can wait until—" "Actually, it can't." He gestured to the man behind him. "This is Brad. He's a process server. He has something for you." The words hit the room like a record scratch. I heard Mrs. Henderson gasp. The young couple at table 7 suddenly found their wine glasses fascinating. Even the jazz trio in the corner seemed to play more quietly, as if they could sense the shift in the atmosphere. Brad stepped forward, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I need to serve you with these papers." Graham's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Divorce papers, to be specific." "Don't worry, honey. You can sign them after the dessert pour. Wouldn't want to ruin everyone's evening." The envelope felt heavier than it should have when Brad placed it in my hands. February 14th. Of course. Graham had always had a flair for the dramatic, but this was a new level of theatrical cruelty. He wanted me to break down here, in front of our customers, in the space I'd helped build with my own hands. I looked down at the papers, noting the law firm's letterhead, the official seals, the careful legal language that would dissolve 12 years of marriage. My mouth tasted like iron, like I'd bitten my tongue hard enough to draw blood. But here's what Graham miscalculated. Women who grow up watching their grandmothers survive impossible things learn early how to swallow pain without showing it. Women who build businesses from red clay and stubbornness know how to think clearly when everything is falling apart. I folded the papers without reading them and slipped them into the pocket of my dress. Then I picked up the decanter and continued my rounds, pouring wine with hands that didn't shake. "The 2019 Cabernet," I told Mr. Washington, my voice level and professional, "has notes of dark cherry and Virginia tobacco. You'll taste the terroir. That's the flavor the soil gives to the grapes." Graham stood there for another moment, clearly expecting tears or shouting or some kind of public breakdown he could use later in court. When I didn't give him the satisfaction, his face shifted from cruel anticipation to confused anger. "Danielle, did you hear what I heard you perfectly." I turned to face him, and I let him see exactly what was in my eyes. Not heartbreak, not surprise, just cold, calculating assessment. "Thank you for coming by. Please close the door on your way out. You're letting in the cold air." The room held its breath. Graham opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly thrown by my composure. Brad was already backing toward the door, his job done, probably eager to get away from whatever marital explosion he'd stumbled into. As they left, I continued serving wine, accepting quiet murmurs of support from our guests, my mind already racing ahead to what came next. Because while Graham thought he delivered his blow, he'd actually just handed me the perfect opening for my own move. I had a midnight shareholders meeting to plan. One that Graham didn't know existed, but would change everything he thought he knew about Hayes and Harrow Cellars. The clock on the wall showed 8:47 p.m. In 3 hours and 13 minutes, I would own his entire world. After the last guest left and I'd blown out the votive candles, I walked down to the barrel room with Graham's divorce papers still folded in my dress pocket and my laptop tucked under my arm. The limestone walls kept the temperature constant down here, perfect for aging wine and, apparently, for plotting the perfect revenge. I settled into the wooden chair I kept beside the French oak casks and opened my laptop. The screen's blue glow illuminated rows of barrels that Graham liked to show off to visitors, telling them about the cooperage in Burgundy where we'd source the wood, the careful toast levels that would impart vanilla and spice notes to our Cabernet. What he never mentioned, because he never bothered to learn, was how every single one of those barrels had been purchased through purchase orders processed by Macon Black Oak Holdings, LLC. Every single one. I pulled up the file I'd labeled mob_holdings_master and smiled at my own small joke. Mob for Macon Oak Black, but also because I'd essentially been running a very legal, very organized operation that Graham had been too arrogant to notice. The spreadsheet that opened contained 12 years of financial architecture that would have impressed my old agricultural economics professors. Every invoice, every expense, every piece of equipment that had built Hayes and Harrow cellars had flowed through my shell company before being allocated to our joint venture. It wasn't fraud. It was just meticulous business management that Graham had dismissed as Danielle's cute spreadsheets whenever I tried to explain our financial structure. I scrolled through the entries, remembering each one. The stainless steel fermentation tanks from Italy, invoiced to Macon Black Oak Holdings, then leased to Hayes and Harrow at fair market rates. The bottling equipment that Graham loved to show off, owned by my LLC, operated under license by our winery. Even the tractor he drove around the vineyard like some gentleman farmer was titled to Macon Black Oak Holdings. The beauty of it was that it had never been hidden. Every document was filed properly with the state. Every transaction was recorded in the books that Graham signed off on quarterly without reading. When our accountant explained the structure during our annual reviews, Graham would nod along while scrolling through his phone, more interested in the bottom-line profit numbers than understanding how those profits were generated. "Whatever makes the most tax sense, babe," he'd say, waving his hand dismissively. "You handle the boring stuff. The boring stuff." If he only knew. I clicked over to the corporate documents folder and opened the Hayes and Harrow Cellars LLC operating agreement, the one Graham had signed with such flourish 7 years ago, joking about how he was making it official with his wife. He'd signed it at our kitchen table over morning coffee, barely glancing at the pages while I explained the partnership structure. Macon Black Oak Holdings will be the majority member with 51%, I'd said clearly, pointing to the relevant sections. Your capital contribution gets you 49%. Sounds good, he'd replied, already reaching for his phone to check email. As long as we're partners, right? Partners. The word tasted bitter now, like wine that had turned to vinegar. I pulled up the email thread with Aunt Pearl from earlier that day. She'd been monitoring the situation from Atlanta, where she kept Macon Black Oak Holdings' primary offices in the spare bedroom of her Buckhead condo. When I texted her about the divorce papers, her response had been swift and decisive. Time to call a special shareholders meeting. I'll be there by midnight. As the managing member of Macon Black Oak Holdings, I had the authority to call emergency meetings with 24 hours notice. But in cases of material threats to company assets, like a divorce proceeding that could tie up our business holdings, I could convene an emergency session with just 4 hours notice. I checked my watch. 9:23 p.m. Perfect timing. I began typing the formal notice, my fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Notice of Emergency Shareholders Meeting Macon Black Oak Holdings LLC February 14th, 11:59 p.m. Crawford County Vineyard Office. Agenda Item 1. Resolution regarding potential asset protection measures. Agenda Item 2. Authorization for majority shareholder to execute all necessary documents to protect company interests. Agenda Item 3. Amendment to Hayes and Harrow Cellars LLC operating agreement. But I wasn't just drafting a corporate resolution. I was crafting something much more poetic, a Valentine's Day toast that would double as the most beautiful business maneuver Graham would never see coming. I opened a new document and began writing. My dear friends and partners, tonight we celebrate love. The love of land, the love of craft, and the love of honest partnership. When Hayes and Harrow Cellars was founded, it was built on a foundation of trust, shared dreams, and carefully structured agreements that protected all parties involved. Each word was chosen carefully, each sentence constructed to sound like a heartfelt speech, while actually serving as a formal board resolution. I wove in the legal language that would authorize me to exercise full control over our business assets, disguised as romantic metaphors about soil and cultivation and the patience required to produce something truly valuable. The genius of it was that Graham would probably applaud when I gave this speech tomorrow night. He'd think I was being gracious in defeat, acknowledging his vision and leadership. He wouldn't realize until much later that every word was legally binding corporate action that had just transferred complete operational control of his beloved winery to the woman he'd tried to humiliate. By the time I finished writing, it was nearly 11 p.m. I saved the documents, closed my laptop, and walked back upstairs to change clothes. Aunt Pearl would be arriving soon, and I had one last detail to arrange. I pulled Graham's divorce papers from my dress pocket and set them on the kitchen counter next to a bottle of our 2020 rose, the one we'd planned to debut tomorrow night. Tomorrow was going to be perfect. 24 hours later, Hayes and Harrow's tasting room was packed beyond capacity for what Graham had advertised as our Valentine's recovery party, his idea of turning yesterday's drama into a marketing opportunity. He'd sent emails to every distributor, import agent, and wine blogger within 100 miles, promising big announcements and exciting developments for the vineyard. If he only knew how right he was. The jazz trio I'd hired, the same musicians who'd witnessed yesterday's debacle, played soft standards from the corner while servers moved through the crowd with trays of our newest vintage. Import agents from Atlanta and Savannah mingled with local distributors, their conversations a mix of business gossip and speculation about what they'd heard happen the night before. Graham worked the room like the consummate performer he'd become, all charm and expansive gestures, telling anyone who'd listen about his vision for Hayes and Harrow's future. He wore his lucky navy blazer, the one he'd worn to our first wine competition, and had styled his hair with extra care. This was his comeback tour, his chance to show everyone that whatever personal drama had unfolded yesterday, business would continue as usual. I watched him from behind the bar, wearing the emerald green dress I'd bought for tonight specifically. Aunt Pearl stood beside me, impeccable in her black St. John suit, looking every inch the successful Atlanta attorney she'd been for 3 decades. To anyone observing, we looked like the gracious hostess and her distinguished guest, sharing wine and quiet conversation. What they couldn't see was the embossed folder resting on the shelf beneath the bar, or the pen I'd tucked into my clutch, the same Mont Blanc fountain pen Graham had given me for our anniversary 3 years ago. "You ready for this, baby girl?" Aunt Pearl murmured, her voice barely audible over the saxophone solo drifting across the room. "I've been ready for 12 years, I replied, my fingers finding the divorce papers in my purse. At exactly 8:30 p.m., I stepped to the center of the room and gently tapped my champagne flute with a silver knife. The crowd turned toward me, conversations trailing off as Graham beamed from across the room, clearly expecting me to announce our reconciliation or perhaps my graceful exit from the business. "Friends, partners, fellow lovers of good wine," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the packed room. "Tonight we celebrate love, the love of land, the love of craft, and the love of honest partnership." Graham's smile widened. Several people applauded softly. "When Hayes and Harrow Cellars was founded 7 years ago," I continued, "it was built on a foundation of trust, shared dreams, and carefully structured agreements that protected all parties involved." I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the faces of our distributors and import agents. "Tonight, I want to ensure that foundation remains strong." I reached into my purse and withdrew the divorce papers, their legal weight somehow feeling lighter in the warm glow of the tasting room lights. Several people near the front gasped as they recognized what I was holding. Yesterday, my husband served me with divorce papers on Valentine's Day, in front of our customers, hoping I would break down and sign them in humiliation. My voice remained steady, conversational. "I'm going to sign them now, not in humiliation, but in celebration of truth." The room went dead silent except for the jazz trio, who continued playing as if this were completely normal dinner theater. I uncapped my Mont Blanc pen and signed each page with deliberate care, my signature flowing across the documents that would legally dissolve my marriage while simultaneously freeing me to execute the business plan I'd been developing for months. But before we toast new beginnings, I said, sliding the signed papers across the bar to Graham, whose face had gone pale, I have another announcement to make. I reached under the bar and withdrew the embossed folder Aunt Pearl and I had prepared that morning, its cream-colored paper bearing the gold seal of Macon Black Oak Holdings, LLC. Marcus. I called to our primary import agent from Savannah, a distinguished black man in his 50s who'd been working with us for 3 years. Sarah. I addressed our Atlanta distributor, a sharp-eyed woman who controlled wine placement in half the restaurants in the metro area. I believe you'll want to see this. I handed Marcus the folder first. He opened it with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that wine business documents could make or break deals. As he read, his eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. Well, I'll be damned, he breathed, then caught himself and cleared his throat. Excuse my language, but Danielle, you own 51% of Hayes and Harrow. The words rippled through the crowd like wine spilling across white linen. Graham's champagne flute slipped from his fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. I do indeed, I confirmed, raising my own glass. Through Macon Black Oak Holdings, LLC, which has been the majority shareholder since our founding. All import licenses, export compliance certifications, and federal permit transfers run through my company. Sarah was reading over Marcus's shoulder now, her business-focused mind already calculating the implications. That means, I said, enjoying the moment more than I probably should have, that any distributor agreements, any export contracts, any federal licensing, all of it requires my signature as the majority owner. The applause started with Marcus, who understood immediately what this meant for business continuity. Sarah joined in, followed by the other distributors who realized they were looking at stability rather than chaos. Several wine bloggers were already pulling out their phones, probably composing headlines about the founder's wife, who was actually the founder. Graham stood frozen among the celebrating crowd, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and what looked like dawning comprehension. The golden boy who'd spent 12 years believing his own press releases was finally reading the fine print. So, I concluded, raising my champagne flute higher, here's to honest partnerships, careful planning, and the patient cultivation of exactly what you want to harvest. The room erupted in genuine applause and laughter. Someone called out speech, but I just smiled and sipped my champagne, watching Graham realize that his Valentine's Day ambush had backfired more spectacularly than he could have imagined. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The party wound down around 11 p.m., with distributors and import agents lingering to shake my hand and exchange business cards. Marcus slipped me his private number, murmuring about expanded distribution opportunities now that we know who's really in charge. Sarah mentioned something about a premium placement program her company was launching next quarter. Graham had vanished somewhere during the congratulations and networking, but I could feel his presence like a storm system moving in from the west. Aunt Pearl helped me clear the last of the champagne flutes, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the back hallway where we'd seen him disappear. You want me to stay? She asked, folding the signed shareholder resolutions into her briefcase with the satisfaction of someone who just executed a perfect legal maneuver. No, I've got this. I kissed her cheek, breathing in her familiar scent of Chanel No. 5 and quiet power. Drive safe back to Atlanta. I'll call you tomorrow. After she left, I walked through the tasting room, turning off lights and blowing out the remaining candles. The silence felt different now, not empty, but full of possibility. This space that I designed and decorated, where I'd served thousands of glasses of wine and watched couples fall in love and anniversary parties unfold, was finally, legally, completely mine. I was reaching for the light switch when I heard footsteps on the stairs leading down to the barrel room. Heavy, deliberate, angry footsteps that could only belong to one person. I found Graham in the cellar, standing among the French oak barrels like some tragic figure from a Tennessee Williams play. His lucky blazer was wrinkled now, his carefully styled hair disheveled. In the dim lighting from the single overhead bulb, he looked older than his 34 years, older and smaller than the man who'd burst into the tasting room with divorce papers just 24 hours ago. "You played me," he said without turning around. His voice echoed off the limestone walls, flat and hollow. "For 12 years, you played me." I descended the stairs slowly, my heels clicking against the stone steps. "I built this, Graham. We built this. The difference is that I paid attention to the details while you chased the spotlight." He whirled around then, and I saw something dangerous in his eyes. Not physical violence, but the cornered animal fury of someone whose entire world had just shifted beneath his feet. Those were my investors, my contacts, my reputation that brought them here. His voice cracked on the last word, and I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Your contacts who are now very interested in working with the actual majority owner," I replied calmly. "Your reputation that was built on wine I helped craft, in facilities I helped finance, using grapes grown in soil I've been nursing for 7 years. I'm going to fight this." He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the wine on his breath and see the red flush of rage creeping up his neck. "I'll contest the ownership structure. I'll claim fraud, coercion, whatever it takes." I almost laughed. "With what lawyer? The one who advised you to serve me divorce papers in public without reviewing our corporate structure first?" That hit home. I watched the realization creep across his face, the same expression he'd worn in college when he finally understood a particularly complex chemistry equation. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued, my voice taking on the tone I used when explaining winemaking processes to particularly dense visitors. "You have 2 choices. You can accept a fair market buyout for your minority stake. I'll have the business valued by an independent appraiser, and you'll get every penny you're legally entitled to. Or what?" The words came out as a snarl. "Or you can stay on as minority vintner under my leadership. You know winemaking, Graham. I'll give you that. You can keep making wine, keep your consulting deals, keep traveling to those conferences you love so much. But the business decisions, the expansion plans, the partnerships, those run through me now." He stared at me for a long moment, his breathing shallow and rapid. I could see him calculating, trying to find an angle, some way to regain control. "The media's going to have a field day with this," he said finally, grasping for leverage. "Divorce drama at local winery. Business partners turn bitter. Think about how that looks for your precious brand." I pulled out my phone and showed him the screen. 3 missed calls from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, 2 from the Wine Spectator, and a text from a blogger who'd been at tonight's party. "Actually," I said, "their running with founder's wife was actually the founder all along." Turns out investors love a good underdog story about a smart woman who built something while her husband took credit. His face went ashen. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious." Marcus called his editor friend at Wine Business Monthly on his way home tonight. Something about how this proves Georgia wine country has the business sophistication to compete nationally. I slipped the phone back into my purse. Funny how quickly the narrative changes when people learn the truth. Graham sank onto one of the wine barrels, his head in his hands. For a moment, he looked like the college boy I'd fallen in love with, vulnerable, overwhelmed, human. "You want to know the really funny part?" I said, not unkindly. "Your lawyers probably already discovered the fraudulent expense accounts." His head snapped up. "What are you talking about?" "All those business trips to Napa. The consulting fees you've been charging to Hayes and Harrow for work you did for other vineyards. The equipment you bought for the house but ran through company accounts." I shrugged. "Contesting my ownership means opening our books to discovery. You sure you want a judge looking at 12 years of financial records?" The fight went out of him like air from a punctured balloon. He'd been caught and we both knew it. "So," I said, "buyout or partnership under new management. What's it going to be?" 1 year later, I stood in the same barrel room where Graham had made his last stand, watching sunlight stream through the windows we'd added during the renovation. The limestone walls now held temperature control systems I'd installed, and the French oak barrels bore new labels. Estate Reserve D. Hayes Vigneron. In my hands, I held the first bottle of Redemption Rose, a blend of our estate-grown Pinot Noir and Grenache that had been my secret project for the past 18 months. The label was simple, elegant, flowing script that read Danielle Hayes, Vigneron, beneath an illustration of red clay soil with vine roots growing deep. Ms. Hayes. Keisha, one of our summer interns, appeared at the top of the stairs. The bottling line is ready for the final batch. I smiled up at her. Keisha was a junior at Spelman College, majoring in chemistry with dreams of becoming a winemaker. One of 6 young Black women spending their summer learning every aspect of viticulture through the Hayes and Harrow Scholarship Program I'd launched 6 months ago. Watching them work reminded me of myself at their age, hungry for knowledge and opportunity in an industry that didn't always make space for people who looked like us. Perfect timing, I said, following her upstairs to the production facility. The changes over the past year had been remarkable. After the media attention from what wine bloggers had dubbed the Valentine's Day revelation, investment offers had flooded in. But instead of expanding rapidly, I'd chosen growth that aligned with my values. The internship program, a partnership with the University of Georgia's Viticulture Department, a mentorship network for women of color in wine and agriculture. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution had run a 3-part series about the quiet revolution happening in Georgia wine country. Wine Spectator featured us in their Women to Watch issue. But the moment I was proudest of came when the Atlanta Food and Wine Festival invited me to give the keynote address at their annual conference. Standing on that stage in front of 800 industry professionals, I told the truth about building Hayes and Harrow, about the invisible labor that women and people of color contribute to businesses where others take credit. The standing ovation lasted 4 minutes. Afterward, young women of every background approached me with their own stories, their own dreams, their own carefully constructed plans for success. The final numbers look good, Marcus called from across the bottling floor, clipboard in hand. As our new director of operations, he'd proven invaluable in expanding our distribution network. We'll have 2,400 cases of the Redemption Rose ready for next week's release. I nodded, watching the bottles move down the line with mechanical precision. Each one represented a small victory, not just over Graham's attempt to humiliate me, but over every voice that had told me I was along for the ride instead of driving the car. Speaking of Graham, he appeared in the doorway of the production facility right on schedule. We'd settled into an oddly functional working relationship over the past year. He'd chosen to stay on as head winemaker rather than take the buyout, partly because no bank would give him a loan large enough to start over, and partly because he'd finally realized that making wine was what he actually loved, not the business side he'd never been good at anyway. The 2023 Viognier is testing perfectly, he reported, his tone professional but not unfriendly. Should be ready for bottling next month. Excellent, I replied. How are the new interns working out in the vineyard? They're asking better questions than most of my consulting clients, he admitted with something that might have been pride. Keisha wants to experiment with malolactic fermentation for the Chardonnay. I told her to write up a proposal. It was strange how much more I liked Graham when he wasn't trying to be the center of attention. Turns out, underneath all that bluster had been someone who genuinely cared about winemaking craft. He just needed to learn his place in the bigger picture. His consulting business had taken off in ways neither of us expected. Word had spread through the industry about the man who'd learned to read fine print the hard way, and startup wineries were eager to hire someone who could help them avoid the legal and financial pitfalls he'd stumbled into. Graham was finally earning money from his actual expertise instead of riding on investments and charm. How's the preparation for next week's launch going? He asked. Perfectly. I held up the bottle of Redemption Rose. Magazine coverage, distributor tastings, and a waiting list that's already twice our production capacity. He nodded, and I caught something in his expression that might have been respect. You've done amazing things with this place, Danielle. Really amazing. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get from him, and honestly, it was enough. As the sun set over our vineyard, painting the sky the same rose gold color as the wine in my glass, I walked through the rows of vines we'd planted 7 years ago. They were mature now, their roots deep in Georgia red clay, their fruit complex and nuanced in ways that young vines could never achieve. Some harvests, I'd learned, require patience, years of careful cultivation, waiting for the right moment when everything comes together in perfect balance. But others require pruning, cutting away what's no longer serving the vine, making space for new growth, being willing to sacrifice the familiar for the possibility of something better. Standing there among vines that were finally, completely mine, I raised my glass to both kinds of harvests. After all, the best vintages always come from knowing exactly when to wait and exactly when to cut.